I'm Glenn Loury, and I'm a professor of economics at Brown University. I'm in my 70s. I've had a long career as an academic economist.
So you talk about drugs in your memoir. Was crack addictive enough that you did it once and that was it?
Wandering the streets of Boston at 1 o'clock in the morning, looking for a thrill, happen upon a situation. I find myself in a room, people are smoking crack cocaine. I try it, I like it. I really like it. It takes me to another world. It knocks the top of my head off. It gives me a feeling of euphoria. I want to do it again and again. And through that porthole, I entered into an underworld. I was at a halfway house. I was the only professor in the place.
That's wild.
I don't expect a person to sympathize with the protagonist of this book necessarily, but God, a life lived fully and reported candidly, I'm the better for knowing it.
Do you have people that were angry with you for anything that you wrote in there?
Yes, my friend, he said to me, I'm not sure I like that guy.
Oh, no.
And I responded by saying, I am not that guy. I'm not sure I like him either. That guy could never have written this book.
Glenn Loury, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be talking with you. I've been following you for a while on social media, and you're brilliant. So it's an honor to have you on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for that compliment.
For anyone who isn't familiar with you or your work, could you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do? And then we'll get into that more.
Okay, I'm Glenn Loury, and I'm a professor of economics at Brown University. I'm in my 70s. I've had a long career as an academic economist. I'm also a podcaster and social critic and write a Substack and am a pundit who comments on affairs of the day. Race has been one of my beats as an economist, but also as a social critic. I've talked about racial inequality and the issues of racism and so-called race relations in the United States for a long time. I'm relatively conservative in my political orientation and somewhat heterodox and iconoclastic in my opinion. So that's it. I like to think of myself as a well-rounded person. I am a technical specialist in economics, but I'm also an intellectual and a person who's a citizen of the world. And I don't know, does that get the job done?
That does. That was perfect. So you recently published a memoir, and so we're going to spend most of the time talking about that, and then we might talk about politics a little bit. But your memoir is Late Admissions: Confessions of a Black Conservative, and I thought it was brave. I think anyone who writes a memoir, honestly, is pretty brave because the human life it's weird and is awkward. And you got into a lot of details about your youth. So I think we might as well start there. Can we talk about what it was like for you when you were like fairly young growing up and then through your teenage years, some events that stood out?
I grew up in Chicago. I was born in 1948. There's the African-American family and community, working middle class, lower middle class. I was a bright kid in school. I got double promotions when I was in grade school and entered high school at age 12. I was younger than the other kids in my cohort, and that chafed at me a little bit. You know, I wasn't so effective in the dating game and getting girls to like me and fulfilling my aspirations for romance. But I was bright, I was precocious, I was the most talkative in my class. I was good at math, so forth.
And did switching schools a number of times? I switched schools. I think I switched schools 4 times too before the age of grade 4. Like a lot. It was almost every year. Do you think that negatively impacted you overall?
It did, but I recovered from it. I was getting poor grades in the second and third grade because I was switching schools so much, and the instability must have affected me because I was a bright kid. But when I finally did settle down, when we moved in with my aunt, I started impressing my teachers and even was recommended for a scholarship at the University of Chicago Laboratory School, the private academy on the Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago, although my parents ended up deciding not to send me there. But I'm sure moving around wasn't a good thing. That's the reason that my aunt insisted that my mother move in with her and settle down.
Okay, that's interesting. And just out of curiosity, what was the difference? How come your aunt ended up like a stable person with your mom being more fluid? Do you know?
I don't know. That's a hard question. People differ. My aunt was the matriarch. She was the oldest of the cohort of the four of them. My mother, their two brothers, and my aunt constituted the Cartmans. They were, my middle name is Cartman. That's my mother's maiden name. And they lost their mother. My grandmother died in her 30s. And my
Oh,
mother was 12 years old when my grandmother passed. And they were all farmed out to live with different relatives,
oh,
sisters of my mother's mother, who took in her children after my grandmother passed. So they had different experiences. Uh, but I can just tell you that my Auntie Lois was solid as a rock. And I start the book with depicting a scene where on Sunday she'd call us in. We've been to church to report about what was in the sermon. And she was quite strict about it. She wanted to hear you tell her what you got out of going to that service that day. And I took it as quite a challenge, an intellectual challenge, but also kind of, a performance challenge. I wanted to impress her. And I learned lessons from that experience, which I think uh, were to my benefit later in life.
yeah. Okay, okay, interesting. Um, did you have faith for your entire life, or is this something that you fell away from and then returned to?
Well, the faith that I had when I was a kid coming up in Chicago, going to that church that my aunt was asking about, was inherited faith. It was all I knew. I was a kid. I did what my parents directed me to do, um, and I fell away from that. But I found faith again later in my life. I was baptized for a second time at the age of 40. This time not as an infant, but as a grown man embracing Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. And actually, as time has gone by, I've kind of fallen away from that as well. And I talk about that in the book. I'm happy to talk about it here if you want. Uh, so it's been a up and down encounter.
So, what made you decide to write a like a few questions about the memoir. One, what made you decide to write it? And two, you go into a lot of detail about mistakes you've made throughout your life. Like everybody makes mistakes, but it's hard to publish that as really showing people who you are. So, what made you decide to write the memoir, and what are you hoping people get from it?
So this is a project that has evolved. It's gone through stages. I think I first started talking about a memoir 10, 12 years ago. I was going to call it Changing My Mind, and I was going to tell the story about my meandering political sensibilities of being, a Black kid from Chicago, working class kid. So naturally, perhaps a little bit, progressive in my orientation, to becoming a Reagan conservative in the 80s, to breaking with the neoconservative and conservative intellectual community that I had embedded myself in the late 90s and in the aughts, to reverting in most recent time to the posture that I announced in the title of the book, Confessions of a Black Conservative. So I was going to talk about my politics. And I thought that was interesting. I thought it was challenging. I thought I owed people, friends, former comrades, an account. But that's not the only thing that's gone on in my life. And as I began to think about that initial conception of the project, I realized that it was arid. It was didn't have life. It wasn't true to life. It wasn't true to my life. And I entered into a period of introspection. Now, this is going back a decade or so. I entered into a period of introspection and came out the other side of it thinking that the book was about the struggle with drug addiction. I had a real problem with cocaine in the 1980s. The struggle with, if you want to call it sex addiction, with being enamored of cultivating extramarital sexual relationships with people of the opposite sex. This was something that I had to struggle with, that had profound consequences for my life, that was injurious to those who loved me and counted on me, that was reflective of my character, that was a betrayal in some sense of the highest, most noble possibilities that my life bequeathed to me, and this kind of thing. And I needed to look at it. And so the title of the book became The Enemy Within. Rather than changing my mind, it was about the struggle against the enemy within, the struggle with the enemy within, the tug of war. And that brought me into contact with the stuff that you made mention of, the revelations, the confessions, the report. And you asked me, why did I elect to expose myself in that way? And I think you're giving me a lot of time here, Mikhaila. I appreciate it. Thank you. I assume there will be editing, but in any case, I think this thing just got out of hand. It kind of took on a life of its own. I didn't start out intending. But all kinds of different depths were plumbed as I began to immerse myself in the project of recounting. And I realized that in a way, I was both the author and the audience for the project. In a way, I was trying to explain myself to myself somehow. And I think perhaps justify myself to myself somehow. And to make a long story short, you've asked me, how could I come to reveal so much about myself? I'm writing to myself as well as about myself, and there's no point in lying to myself. Self-delusion, self-aggrandizement, this is the meta dimension to my autobiography project. The part of it when I reflect on the fact that I am reflecting on my own life. And when I have a cover story, when I have a nice, pretty, cultivated account that is presentable, that I can give of my life to the public, but I know that that's not the true basis of how I behaved in that situation and what I was thinking and what I was about. If I stick with the cover story, I'm the one who's the loser at the end of the day. I don't know if that made any sense whatsoever.
Oh no, that made total sense. I think the reason I asked that question, I don't know if you know anything about me, but I've been like incredibly, unbelievably ill for most of my life. I'm out of it now, which is why I can think well enough to talk to you. But
I'm glad.
Yeah. But I kind of got through it by keeping notes and just writing down the ridiculous things that were happening, hoping to eventually write a memoir that I've like half started. And it's hard to figure out, life's not like particularly pretty. Even people who have prettier lives don't have that pretty of a life. So it's complicated. Did you have people that were angry with you for anything that you wrote in there?
Yes. And some of them are close relations of mine.
Yeah. How did you deal with that?
Well, we're still dealing with it in a way.
Oh man.
Lovingly, I hope, and with patience and understanding and mutual respect. I had a dear friend, someone I've known for 50 years, practically begged me not to publish the book, thinking that it was an act of self-sabotage, that I would so besmirch my reputation. And I tried to explain to him the gambit. It's a bet. I'm betting that people will see, and I shouldn't be the one to say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway, the courage, the kind of integrity to the truth about a life the candor, the spirit that tells this tale about himself, who clearly is more than these particular incidents. He is actually the means by which you come to know these things about himself, but he's removed a bit from it as he recounts the tale, and his vulnerability and his humanity, his honesty, his courage. I repeat myself, will win him something with the reader. Will win him. I'm not going to say sympathy because I don't expect a person to sympathize with the protagonist of this book necessarily, but a kind of respect, a kind of appreciation. God, a life lived fully and reported candidly. I'm the better for knowing it. Kind of reaction from the reader. This is what I'm going for. And the guy, by the way, I said to my friend who said, he said to me, he had read a draft of the book. I'm not sure I like that guy.
Oh no.
And I responded by saying, I am not that guy. I'm not sure I like him either. That guy could never have written this book.
That's intense. It's scary. I'm impressed anyway. I think it was brave. I don't think all memoirs are written in that way, right? That actually show what people are like. So I think it's impressive. Hello out there, internet people. Something I don't talk about a ton is the amount of blood work I've had done over the years trying to optimize my health. Believe it or not, it's not just me testing foods out on myself. I've also done liters of blood work. I've partnered with Merrick Health, a telehealth company with extremely competent doctors for health optimization. I seriously recommend these guys. Hormones are completely out of whack in most people, and bioidentical hormone therapy can be super life-changing, but you don't have to go that far. My first suggestion is to optimize your diet and lifestyle, but I'd also suggest doing blood work and talking to Merrick Health. Merrick Health offers in-depth hormone panels as well as a ton of other blood work. A lot of the blood work you get tested at regular doctor's offices doesn't go in depth properly. And if you're going to try to optimize hormones, you definitely want someone treating you who knows what they're doing. The doctors that work with Merrick are very in the know about lifestyle optimization, can prescribe hormones, peptides, high quality vitamins, supplements, etc. I use them for blood work. My dad uses them, my brother uses them, my husband uses them. They do your blood work and then thoroughly explain the markers and suggest treatments. If you want to try the same hormone panel I've had done, you can check them out at merrickhealth.com/Mikhaila. So many people have hormone problems nowadays that could be fixed with some supplements or hormone therapy, diet, lifestyle, of course, and they could feel so much better. So check them out at merrickhealth.com/Mikhaila, code MP for 10% off at checkout. They're pinned in the description as well. They're the only telehealth company I trust at the moment to give you a doctor that's going to treat you properly. Enjoy the rest of this episode. What made you decide to aggressively pursue academia as a job, your career for your life?
Yeah, well, that happened when I decided to go to graduate school. So I graduated from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, north of Chicago in 1972. I was a transfer student there on a scholarship. I was a full-time student, but also a full-time employee at a factory as a clerk. I had a young family. I was married with two young children and going to college full-time and working full-time. And I was discovering my gift, my gift for being able to do sophisticated mathematical analysis with relative ease. And that was discovered when I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, and I concentrated in economics. That was my major. I'm sorry, my major was in mathematics, but my minor was in economics. And I decided to go to graduate school. They said, my teachers, you're very gifted. You could do well. You could be a professional economist. They pointed me toward an academic career, and I found it to my liking. And so when I got to MIT, a PhD program, and everybody in the program aspires to get a job as almost everybody, as a young scholar on a tenure track in a good economics department to publish in the journals and to pursue their research interests. And I got on that track in my early 20s, and I haven't looked back. And I found it to be very rewarding in the sense that I set my own agenda of what it is that I work on and what it is that I do. My time, I read books, I read people's papers and follow what's going on in the world, and then I write and speak, teach. Teaching is just such a wonderful thing. I've found this way of living to be quite compatible with my abilities and my interests. So I've been a professor since 1976.
Wow. Do you think part of the reason you've got to where you've gotten to is because you had a more difficult childhood? Do you think that pushed you to want to prove more? And the reason I'm asking you that is because, like, I have a couple of kids and I'm trying to figure out how to raise them in a way that's like, you don't want to give them too much. I feel like part of the thing that makes people successful is facing difficulty at a young age. But I'm not sure if that's absolutely necessary for people. So do you think it was helpful to you? Or do you think you would have ended up where you are with less to go through?
You invite me to kind of pat myself on the back here, and I'm going to go ahead and accept the invitation. No, I think that coming up the hard way and I think that struggle made me better and equipped me for further struggle. Uh, Nothing was handed to me on a silver platter. I mean, my father, I had a good relationship with my father. My father was successful as an accountant. He worked for the Internal Revenue Service. He went to law school. At night, he advanced up the managerial ranks. He closed out his career when he retired in his mid-60s as the director of the Kansas City Service Center, which is a huge income tax return processing facility in Kansas City, over which my father was the presiding officer. So, he was not rich. He was a bureaucrat. He lived on his salary. But he was quite a model of discipline and of accomplishment. He and my mother divorced when I was young, as I said, but he was a constant presence in my life. And when I dropped out of college and my girlfriend got pregnant, and I kind of was bouncing around before I finally settled down at Northwestern University and started my academic career. When I was kind of bouncing around, he was disappointed, and his disappointment troubled me. But I had his example. You asked me about myself and my own struggles, but I had his example of struggle and of discipline to inspire me. When I got to graduate school, I had a briefcase I carried around, and on either side of it, I had pasted bumper stickers, orange lettering on a black background that said, "Rise above it!" exclamation point. That's what I carried into the classroom when I sat down and put my briefcase down in the aisle next to my chair, a briefcase that announced to the world that this guy here is going someplace. He's on the move. He's hungry. He's serious. Because when I looked around, I saw a bunch of rich kids, who didn't have to work a full-time job and didn't have a wife and two kids at home in his early 20s, et cetera, et cetera. So it toughened me up. It gave me determination. It gave me a sense of confidence in my own abilities. I think coming up and having to overcome obstacles was helpful to me.
So then how did you, as a parent, obviously as a parent, you try to shield your kids, right, from troublesome times. Did you think about that while raising your kids, about if you were presenting them with enough difficulties, or did they experience enough difficulties as it was?
Oh, this is your question, but you put it to me. Okay. And I basically have two sets of kids, one that was born when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and the other that were born when I was in my early 40s. I was less present in raising my older children because their mother and I split up when they were pretty young. I didn't have the kind of relationship with them, and I talk about this in the book, that they deserved, and that in retrospect, I wish that I had found the time and had the focus to develop and to sustain. So when you say raising them, well, their mother raised them. I wasn't consciously in the meeting about how much structure, what are we going to do for our children? Those conversations weren't really taking place with my older children. With my younger children, it was a very real part. The question of we're prosperous. My wife and I, both PhDs, my late wife, Linda, we're living in suburban Boston. Public schools or private schools is one of the kinds of decisions that we have to make. And there are many, many other kinds of decisions. I can remember one summer, Glenn and Nehemiah, we were sending them to a summer camp, and there was a bullying Glenn on the bus. And it was a Black kid bullying Glenn. And the question for us became, do we change the program, which we ended up doing, and sent them someplace else so he didn't have to encounter the bully, or do we tell him to stand up to the bully? So my wife prevailed. I wanted him to stand up to the bully. She prevailed and said, we'll just find another program where it's not so rough. And then I realized that the real thing was we were upper middle class, but I was working class coming up. And the working class kid fights the bully on the bus. This is the thing that you have to do. What upper middle class parent sends their kid to a summer camp where he has to fight a bully on the bus? I was imposing a nostalgia for my own rough upbringing on my son. I wasn't spoiling him by removing him from the conflict situation and whatnot. It wasn't making him soft to do that. That was a delusion to think that. It seemed to me ultimately. Again, I don't know if I'm being responsive to the question that you've asked me, Mikhaila, but
that was pretty much what I was looking for. It's just been something I've been thinking about over the years, is whether or not experiencing. I mean, I've come to the same conclusion as you. So I didn't have an upbringing like yours. I had, I would say we were middle class in Toronto, but I went to a whole bunch of different high schools and elementary schools. They were public, and public schools in a downtown city they're not the same as private schools in a downtown city. Like my art school as a teenager had a ravine behind the subway station where people did tons of different drugs. And you just learn how to navigate that, and it's fine. And it was interesting at the time. But I've come to the conclusion that it's probably better having more money and just not encountering those scenarios, because I don't think you need to encounter those scenarios in your life as a person. But I don't know. It's hard to decide how much you should experience and how that pushes you to success. But then, is even success worth that? I don't know. So that's the background of where I was coming from anyway. Okay, let's see. We could switch directions a little bit. I would like to hear your comments on the recent debate, if you have any thoughts on that, Trump and Biden.
Yeah. I was watching that thing in real time with my wife, my lovely wife, Lawan, who is a curse on both their houses. She has contempt for the Democrats. She calls them do-nothing Democrats, and contempt for the Republicans. I don't know if I can say this on your podcast, but her phrase is two cheeks of the same ass.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Okay, so she's kind of a nihilist, and she watches all these ultra radical podcasts and stuff. I'm not going to name them because I don't want to get her into trouble or myself into trouble. And she has all these kind of ideas. And so she's watching for entertainment's sake. And I'm watching because, I want to hear how Trump and Biden face off against each other. And from the very opening gate, I was saying to her, look at him. I'm talking about Biden. Look at him. Look at his eyes. Look at his mouth. He won't close his mouth. Look at him. He looks like he's lost. He's staring into space. And then he started to speak. And that thing about we finally beat Medicare or something like that comes out. And he has that senior moment where he loses himself in the middle of the thing and he doesn't know where he is. And I thought, this cannot be happening. Oh my God, I thought, this is definitive. And so you could take it from there. I thought two things. I thought, they have been lying to us. They have been gaslighting us, I thought. This is like in The Wizard of Oz when the curtain gets pulled back by the dog and you see the guy with the white hair back there pulling on all the levers and whatnot, and you realize that that's the machine that's been making all the sounds and there's no magic. This was like a revelatory moment. I thought they've been lying to us. And the second thing I thought, and I cannot be the only person thinking this, is who is running this country? Who's in charge here? If we are or are not negotiating or encouraging the Ukrainians to negotiate with the Russians about this war that could be World War III in the making, who's thinking that through? Not that guy.
Yeah.
And I thought I can't be the only person thinking this. You know, the leaders of important countries throughout the world have got to be asking themselves the same questions.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone has any real idea what's going on. Do you think, given the negative feedback from the debate, that they'll pull Biden and replace him with somebody else? Or do you think they're just going to go ahead and see what happens?
Well, we're all holding our breath and waiting to see what's going to happen on that front. I'm reading the newspaper just like you are, and there are a lot of different kinds of reports going on. The calls for him to step down are echoing throughout the media. I mean, the New York Times, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and everybody in between. There's particular columnists and opinion makers and whatnot. It's a moment such as I've never seen. I'm watching with great interest to see how it unfolds. We're told that he's not going to pull that Jill Biden and Hunter Biden are tugging on his shirt tail and telling him to stay the course. I don't understand the inner workings of big league politics well enough to know about what donors are going to do and who the kingmakers are. It would appear that Barack Hussein Obama is one of them.
It would. I heard who knows, and who knows what's floating around on X and what's real on that platform. But I heard that Obama was concerned as well at this point, to put it lightly. Yeah.
But like you say, who knows? Because it's all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, exactly. I was watching a podcast you did with someone, and they went into detail about what you were doing in the 80s and kind of the lessons you were teaching young Black men in particular. So can we get into that a bit? And I guess my question is, what were the lessons you were trying to teach people, or what are the lessons you were trying to teach young Black men in particular? Let's start with that.
Well, in the 80s, I had a cover story and a real story. I had a public line and I had a private life. And the public line was pull up your socks, self-help, the pathologies, the enemy within the Black community, out of wedlock births, violence, poor educational performance, family instability, raise your kids, take advantage of the opportunities that exist, live decently, norms, values, rectitude. And the private life was sordid. It involved drugs, it involved sex, it involved not living the way that I was preaching. And the gap between those two is a tension that I try to develop in the book and in my self-examination of my own life. So I'm not sure which one you're referring to when you ask me what was the lessons that I was teaching. Was it the preaching or was it, because this became, or was it the example that I was setting? Because this became an issue for me at one point when some of my peccadillos and failings, moral failings, became public. I still thought that doesn't disprove the validity of my prescription for the community, that, you know, out of wedlock births are not a good thing, even though I was party to one. That you know, hedonism is not a good thing. Discipline is a good thing, even though I allowed myself to indulge my hedonistic impulses on more than one occasion, and so on. And I thought the relationship between my private dealings with the enemy me within Glenn Loury and my public castigation of the enemy within Black America, that those kind of went on in two separate spheres. But I came to believe in the fullness of time that was a serious error, and that the quality of public leadership rests on a foundation that goes down beneath the surface, and you can't see it all the way down. It's not only what you can see, it's what empowers and animates the person who is the advocate. And if I'm on a hollow foundation, how can I have a resonant, robust voice of moral leadership? This kind of thing. Again, I don't know if this makes sense, but or if it's responsive to what it is that you had in mind, Mikhaila, but that's what I think to say.
If you guys are not filtering your air, it is the easiest thing. It's the laziest thing you can do to improve your health. I'm so gung-ho about this. I literally travel with an air purifier for hotel rooms. Seriously. I've been talking about air purifiers for years, but I didn't realize how important they are until I stopped being able to think because of a very moldy house. Air Oasis is top of the line. The type of air filter you buy really matters, and Air Oasis filters down to the right particle size, which is why I'm suggesting them. Air Oasis has a new iAdapt Air model. That's what I'd get. They have a medical grade H13 HEPA filter that filters down to 0.003 microns, which means they trap particles 10 times smaller than most other brands. They have germicidal UV technology to sterilize the air purifier itself and the environment. They also use a silver ion filter that penetrates the cell membrane of mold, bacteria, and viruses and reduces pathogens by up to 99%. I own a number of them. There's one in every room. They're also quiet. They come with free shipping, a lifetime warranty, and a 60-day money-back guarantee. You can get 10% off your purchase by using code MP at checkout by going to airoasis.com/products/iAdaptAir-large or select the size you want with code MP for 10% off. That is linked in the description and in the pinned comment. Enjoy the rest of this episode. Maybe you knew the ideal that you were also aiming for, right? I think a lot of people do that. You know what the ideal is, and they're still trying to aim towards it as well.
That's a good cover story.
Does that sound like a cover story? Maybe I'm too young.
It might be. It might not be, but it could be. It could be the rationalization. I mean,
it totally could be. It totally could be. It probably is. But I suppose if you know what the ideal is, then you should change, right? Rather than reach for it. So maybe that is a cover story. So you talk about drugs in your memoir. How did you end up, why do you think you went in that direction? And then how did you get out of it?
Well, so drugs. So there's cannabis, which was illegal pretty much universally when I was coming along. And then there's hard drugs like cocaine and heroin and methamphetamine. Maybe that's a distinction without a difference in some people's minds. I had always been exposed to people smoking cannabis when I was a kid in Black working class Chicago. My Uncle Mooney, my Aunt Elois's husband, the head of the house that I grew up in, routinely smoked it. He smoked it around the house. He told us kids it was his asthma medicine. Which I doubt if smoking can help you with asthma. But it was that sort of commonplace at family gatherings when the men would sometimes take a drink to the room upstairs and close the door and talk politics and sports and whatnot, and they'd pass around a little something. It would be a joint and people would be in smoking marijuana. So I smoked marijuana coming out as a teenager almost by osmosis, just as a part of the culture that I was embedded in. But hard drugs, cocaine and crack cocaine, freebasing cocaine, smoking crystalline cocaine, almost destroyed me. And it came up on me all of a sudden. I had endured a catastrophe in my life. My relationship with a younger woman when I was a professor at Harvard, whom I was keeping in an apartment unknown to my wife while I was a professor at Harvard and in line for a big job in the Reagan administration. And I got into a fight with this young woman, and she accused me of assaulting her. And I was arrested for assault. I was
Wow.
arrested for a criminal offense, and it was a public event.
That's stressful.
Now, I can say she's not here to speak for herself, but I will say on my account, I didn't assault her, although I did push her out of an apartment. I literally physically, and I treated her very badly and dismissively. And she took the countermeasures that she took, and the situation went. Eventually, she dropped the charges. She didn't come back to cooperate and to testify in any kind of trial. So the charges were dropped against me, and I did not get convicted of that crime. But I was accused of it publicly, and I had to withdraw from the government job. And it was a scandal on the news, front of the newspapers. And I was a high-flying Black conservative with a publication record and a profile in magazines and stuff as this guy coming along criticizing affirmative action. This was the same time that Clarence Thomas was coming along, and I was a kind of junior illustration of the same trend of Reaganite friendly, Black, conservative, up and coming, talented, roughly of the same age. Clarence and I are roughly the same age, Justice Thomas. But in any case, so it was in the midst of that. And I'm now exposed as a fraud. I'm now humiliated and scandalized. And in the depths of that depressed condition, I allowed myself to begin experimenting. I tell the story of how it came about. It is sordid in detail. I don't want to embarrass you or your audience by going into too much detail here, but I basically wandering the streets of Boston at 1 o'clock in the morning, looking for a thrill, happen upon a situation. I find myself in a room, people are smoking crack cocaine. I try it, I like it. I really like it. It takes me to another world. It knocks the top of my head off. It gives me a feeling of euphoria. I want to do it again and again. And through that porthole, I entered into an underworld. And I was, robbed twice at gunpoint. I, was out searching until my ATM credits ran out to buy more cocaine. I was hiding out in seedy motel rooms. I was consorting with dangerous and despicable people. I was one of them, in a way. And at the same time, I had my wife, Linda, the mother of Glenn II and Nehemiah, neither of whom were yet born at this time, worried about where I was at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was my intro into this world of addiction. And I ended up at McLean Psychiatric Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, as an inpatient at the Appleton Recovery Clinic, which was treating alcoholism and substance abuse and drug addiction at a high level of medical sophistication at a renowned psychiatric hospital. And I spent 60 days as an inpatient at that facility over the course of 3 months. I was in for 5 weeks. I came out and relapsed and went back in for the remaining time that my insurance would cover as an inpatient, and moved from there to a halfway house where my roommates were people who had come from shelters, who had just come out of a lockup and a detox. I was at a halfway house with drunks, real drunks. I was the only professor in the place. The guy who ran the house took my car keys away from me and told my wife she was not to have sex with me again until further notice. I lived like that for 5 months in that halfway house before I finally came out. And anyway, I go on, but that was my entering into the world of addiction and my early efforts to free myself from it.
That's wild. So was that like crack addictive enough that you did it once and that was it?
Yeah, I did it once and I wanted to do it again.
Do
Was
you
I quote
think
unquote hooked? Did I have a irresistible physical urge to do it. I'm not sure that is not something which didn't develop over time. If I had been at a party and somebody had offered me something and I had taken a hit, would have been the same as me being in this doldrums and in this kind of depressive state and looking for a way of taking myself out of my real life into some fantasy. I don't know. I think we need a psychiatrist to figure that out.
Wow, that sounds extremely unpleasant. Just from hearing about it. You mentioned at the beginning of the episode that you got baptized again when you were 40. Was it after those events that kind of, brought you to being baptized again?
Yeah, it was immediately after those events. Those events were 1987, 1988, early 1988. And then I went into recovery at the McLean Hospital and then at the halfway house, which I left in Thanksgiving of 1988. And our son, Glenn the second, our first child, Linda, and my first child, Glenn the second, was born in January of 1989. So I was coming out into, the open skies and the new life of a recovered man. And I came out in part as a Christian because the religious dimension of my recovery, there was Alcoholics Anonymous and the meetings and the 12 steps, but there was also a spiritual component that I began to take more and more seriously. I write about this in the book, and came to become a member of a church congregation and to become a stalwart member of that congregation and a student of the Bible and a disciple of the pastor of the church who mentored me in my Christian walk and who baptized me in April of 1989, just a few months after Glenn was born. So it was after the encounter with cocaine and my efforts finally to free myself from it, but not long after. And it was definitely a part of this period in my life when I was redefining my sense of self, reconceiving my sense of self, and the rebirth of my relationship with my wife, to whom I was now in these years absolutely faithful and dedicated, the onset of our family, young Glenn, and then 3 years later, young Nehemiah coming along, and we were standing on our own 2 feet. We were in a pretty healthy situation, I think, and the church was certainly a part of that.
What's happened, I guess, since then? You said that you've fallen away from it for whatever reason. Can you describe why that is?
Well, I can try. It's one of the themes in the book. I know I keep saying that, but I really do want people to read the book because I grapple with these things. There was always trouble brewing. I tell 2 stories that illustrate this. One of them is about my faith walk and about there always having been some issues. One of them is our congregation was relatively charismatic and Pentecostal in its orientation. And a member of the congregation fell ill with breast cancer, a beloved member of the congregation with 3 beautiful children, a woman in her 30s. And she declined, and ultimately she died. And there was a moment as she was near the end when she would share in the announcement period during the service where her things stood. And the scans were coming back and they weren't encouraging. And she shared this, and the pastor urged us to pray. And the congregation began to pray, and the prayer consumed a room of 100 people. And there was fervor, and there was passion, and there was pleading, and there was a plaintive tone to it. And it became powerful, and a rhythm to it, and it built, and it built to a crescendo of the petitioning that the Lord would somehow make a miracle happen in the life of this woman right here, right now. In the name of Jesus, we pray. And I realized that deep, 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 deep down, I didn't believe it was going to make a difference. I thought it was like believing in magic. I thought, no, the doctors don't know everything. Of course, that's true. And yes, presumably random events can happen in life. But beating that cancer by petitioning the invisible Almighty to enact a extra natural act of miraculous intervention, I didn't believe it. Now, please forgive me. I mean no disrespect to anybody. I'm talking about Glenn Loury, and I'm saying I realized I didn't believe it. I prayed on. My wife and I discussed this. We discussed it at length. We, of course, were heartbroken at what was happening to this woman. We, of course, like anybody, would have wanted a miracle to be enacted, but we didn't believe we could bring it about through prayer. In fact, we didn't believe in miracles. Not really. And there's another story like that that I tell, and this is, I know there are answers. I know that there are answers to these questions that I'm raising. I know that our reason is finite and bounded, and that there are things beyond our ken. I know that, but I'm just telling you, you ask me, and I'm telling you, where this kind of blurring of the line where I can't quite see God's face begins. And that was one of the things. And there was another incident that I talk about in the book, which was a young woman who worked for me and who was a member of the church died of a sudden heart disease that overtook her. And I won't go into too much detail except to say that she was at a critical point in her life where she's in her early 40s, and she'd always wanted to go to law school. And she had worked for me very ably as an administrative assistant for years. And ultimately, she took the entrance exam, the LSAT. She got in, she made law review in her first year. She was on a new trajectory in her life. And then suddenly, within months, she was dead. And there was a funeral. Same congregation. But now there's 300 people. And they consume a sanctuary, St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church, located in Central Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was where this funeral took place. Her mother flew in from Louisiana for her daughter's funeral. And I was bereft at the tragic loss of this young woman. And of course, everyone was grieving. But the tone that ultimately overtook the funeral worship service was a joyous celebration of her everlasting life. She was with Jesus now. That's what her mother told me. We came not to mourn the death, but to celebrate the everlasting life, because we've been promised something. And at that moment, I had to make some remarks. I had prepared something. I completely forgot what I had prepared. I stood up, I mumbled through something, but I could not shake the feeling of, well, I'm mad at God because this woman has been taken from us. And I'm mad at my fellow congregants because credulously, almost naively, childlike, they're in a celebratory mood. I wanted to just be still for a moment, pause and look down into the abyss and recognize that it goes all the way down. I wanted to be in awe of the frailty of our human condition. I wanted to be anything but happy. And I found myself pulling down Friedrich Nietzsche when I got home from that funeral, and lapsing into a kind of bitterness and despair and contempt. Oh, God help me for my fellow Christians at that moment. I know this is horrible to say, and I don't take any relish in it. You've asked me about my own struggle with faith, and I was shaken. I was shaken. So those are at least part of the reason I'm a rationalist. I'm a scientist. I'm a person who believes in what you can prove. I always had these doubts, suspending disbelief or suspending my understanding, or accepting things on faith, faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Evidence of things not seen? How can I make sense? How can I make sense of that.
Yep.
And so I lapsed into a kind of agnosticism. I kind of don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was understandable. That was completely understandable. Glenn, I'm going to let you go. That was very interesting, though. Thank you very much for coming on. And like I said, I'll link the book below, so anybody interested in checking it out should check it out.
Well, great. I mean, Mikhaila, it's been good to talk with you, and I look forward. Someone will send me a link or something like that, so I'll know how to access this content once you put it up.
Yes, perfect.